Thank you very much indeed, Lindsey. And that brings us neatly to perhaps hearing a bit more about what Africans think about it from the African perspective. From Winston Mano, who comes from Zimbabwe. He now teaches at the University of Westminster, but he regularly goes back to Zimbabwe and has a lot of connections there. And he made a very interesting study last year of the way that China is perceived in Zimbabwe, particularly through the cartoons, which was a very interesting side strike on it. So Winston, if you could be pretty brief, please.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I was late. It's the Chinese which are passing on this habit of being late. It was partly to do with arrangements for school. I have little ones. But I'm very much grateful to the organizers for inviting me, because I think the topic of China has become one that is compelling in public debates in Africa. Ordinary people at diplomatic level, and also internationally. The issue of China's role is one that is very controversial, one that is dividing views. But I want to talk especially about cultural relations and also China's influence in the media sector. First of all, I don't want to repeat what they said, very good points, but I want to just say that the point that he raised about Chinese going there and being masters, behaving in a masterful way, I think it's something that is now clearly producing a lot of resentment in Africa. There is boiling anger about Chinese involvement, because businesses have closed, because also a lot of people are not paid proper salaries. When you work for the Chinese, it may take months for you to get the salary. I also want to talk about how, especially the Chinese, when they live with locals, the relationship, there's no, the language is an issue, but there's also a clear, it's crude, kind of imperialism, if you want to be blunt, whereby they are building compounds which are separate from the rest of the populations, and they employ high-tech security to prevent locals from participating in this kind of, and this, I think, clearly is producing resentment. And there have been demonstrations, as my colleague has just pointed out, and also the kind of goods that they bring, as in popular parlance, they talk of xinjiang. Xinjiang, in Zimbabwe, they say that, oh, you're wearing a xinjiang, which is something which is not so good. Yeah, it's a second-hand thing, not durable, and so there are those kind of attachments. But I'm not going to ignore the fact that the relationship has produced benefits. But who has benefited? I would argue that the people who have benefited the most in Africa are the politicians who have houses built for them under the table deals that we heard about. And people who have benefited clearly those who are, at the top level. The majority of the population, they see roads being built, but sometimes the Chinese bring their workers with them. And these workers, they don't spend anything, in Africa. They get their salaries, they want to take them back to China, and they don't mix with locals. Some of them, some of the accounts that I have heard are clearly to do with racism as well, that some Chinese men, they impregnated a woman in Zambia, and then the Chinese family did not want to have anything to do with that. So that is to do with cultural relations. But in relation to the media, there have been cases of media jamming. For example, in Zimbabwe, where a lot of civic groups have been fighting for democratic, for a more democratic space and change in the political processes there. The Chinese have been accused of selling equipment that allows the state to filter out signals coming from neighboring Botswana, signals that are against government policy. But this has been repeated also in Ethiopia, for example. And then lastly, I want to mention that there's also been training where journalists in Africa, they go to China and they receive training. And this kind of training is some kind of cultural exchange program which is supposed to result in positive stories in Africa. But so these journalists, they like the money that they receive. They receive up to, I did interviews with Zimbabwean journalists, they get up to $5,000, which Chinese journalists are not getting. And they spend part of it in China, part of it they bring home, and it's good salary for them. And I found this very, very interesting, and it raises a lot of questions. And also there are stories that they are told to avoid, places that they avoid in China. In Africa, the Chinese journalists, when they come, they also write positive stories. This has not necessarily resulted in tourists from the East coming to, say, Zimbabwe, which is tourist staffed at the moment. And so a lot of questions are raised. But however, there have been some benefits, some infrastructure projects have taken off. There have been some cases where China has provided food that's appreciated, and it has also sponsored, it has also helped liberation groups in Africa. That has been appreciated. But however, at the moment, in the post, 1989 post-conflict kind of society we are living in, the role of China is very controversial, and this is being captured on websites like diaspora websites are describing China as enemy number one for, say, Zimbabwe or Africa. Especially the issue, remember the issue with involving the ship with guns that were destined for Zimbabwe. I want to end by reading one example of how China is now involved on the cultural front. This is by Faxon Banda, a professor at Rhodes University in South Africa, where China has now built this Chinese ideological school, because China is now going into culture, spreading its own cultural philosophy, Confucianism, and also other things. This was written by Faxon Banda. He said on one of his visits to his native Zambia, he says, I was drawn to one particularly interesting game, because China has helped set up a casino and an amusement park with games. He says, I was drawn to one particularly interesting game which involved using a shotgun to take aim at the Allied soldiers in Iraq. The more Allied soldiers you gunned down, the more you won. What was interesting about this was that the US and UK-led Allied forces were being signified not as heroes liberating Iraq, but as enemies of freedom and butchers of innocent civilians. It seemed to me that the design of Chinese-made children's games incorporated aspects of China's soft power, gradually embedding Chinese cultural self-definitions in the mind of young Zambian players who visited the theme park. Is this a new form of imperial power? He asks. I will end it. Thank you.